Get your hands off that car before I call the police. Diane Ashcroft's voice cut across the valet circle of the Harbor Crest Yacht Club, sharp and certain, and every head on the terrace turned toward the sound. A tall man in a worn leather jacket stood beside a midnight blue 1967 Shelby Mustang, a set of keys in his hand. He turned and looked at her, unhurried, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that people leaned in to hear it. "This is my car," Keanu Reeves said. Diane laughed. It was not a kind laugh. "Right. A man dressed like you doesn't own a car like that." She turned toward the terrace, toward the rows of members in pastel linen, holding glasses of chilled wine, and raised her voice so it would carry. "Someone call security. This man is trying to steal a car." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And Keanu Reeves, 59 years old, said nothing, and waited, because he had been in some version of this parking lot before, and he knew that the next few minutes were going to cost somebody a great deal, and he was fairly sure it was not going to be him. What Diane Ashcroft did not know, what she could not have guessed from the worn jacket and the 3 days of stubble and the quiet way he held himself, was that she had just called the police on the man who signed off on her salary. There is a kind of certainty that does not require any evidence at all. It runs on something older than evidence. It looks at a person for half a second, takes in the clothes and the posture and the face, and arrives, fully formed, at a verdict, and then spends all its energy defending the verdict instead of checking it. Diane Ashcroft had that kind of certainty. Hold on to it. It matters later. But before we get to how this ended, let me take you back a few hours and show you who the man beside the Mustang actually was, because almost nobody at the Harbor Crest Yacht Club knew, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Keanu Reeves woke that morning in a rented cabin on the quiet side of Lake Tahoe, on the California shore where the pines came down almost to the water, and the tourists mostly did not. He had no staff with him. He had driven up alone 2 days earlier, and he had spent those 2 days doing very little, which was a thing he had to schedule deliberately, because the rest of his life did not allow for it. He made coffee. He sat on the cablespoon's small deck and watched the light come up over the water, the way it turned the lake from slate to silver to a hard, bright blue as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. He did this every morning, wherever he was. 3 minutes, sometimes 5. It was the closest thing he had to a religion, this small daily act of looking at something larger than himself before the day filled up with smaller things. He was a wealthy man, though he worked hard to make sure it did not show, and the not showing was not an accident. It was a discipline, built over decades, the same way some men build a body or a business. Keanu had learned a long time ago that the moment people knew what you were worth, they stopped seeing you and started seeing the number, and he had decided, somewhere in his 40s, that he would rather be underestimated than misunderstood. So he drove old cars, or rather he drove one beautiful old car, and otherwise took the subway when he was in a city that had one. He wore the same 3 jackets until they fell apart. He gave most of it away, quietly, through channels that did not carry his name, and the giving was the part of his life he cared about most and discussed least. The Mustang was the one exception, the one indulgence. He had bought it because when he was young and had nothing, his father had worked in a garage, and a car exactly like this one had come in for repair, and his father had let him sit in it for 10 minutes one slow afternoon, and Keanu had never forgotten the smell of the leather, or the weight of the door, or the feeling, brief and enormous, of sitting inside something that beautiful and being told, for 10 minutes, that it was all right to want things. He had bought the Mustang at 53. He kept it for that 10-year-old kid in the garage. His father had taught him insips in that garage, without ever meaning to teach it, just by living it. His father had been a big man, quiet, with hands that could fix anything. And Keanu had watched the way the world treated him, the way certain customers spoke to him, slow and loud, as though a man in coveralls with grease under his nails could not possibly understand them. And he had watched his father absorb it, again and again, without ever raising his voice. Because his father had understood something that Keanu would spend the next 40 years coming to understand himself. A man who looks a certain way does not get to be angry the way other men get to be angry. The same raised voice that reads as passion in one man reads as menace in another. The same firm word that makes one man respected makes another man a problem. His father had known the math of it, in his bones, and he had made a kind of dignity out of refusing to give anyone the reaction they were waiting for. Stay calm, his father used to say, not because they deserve your calm, but because your calm is the one thing they can't use against you. Keanu had carried that into rooms his father never got to see. He had made stillness into a kind of armor, and, eventually, into a kind of power. He did not raise his voice in boardrooms. He did not raise it in arguments. He did not raise it when someone cut him off in traffic or got his order wrong, or occasionally looked straight through him because he was dressed like a man who did not matter. He had learned that silence, held long enough and steady enough, had a gravity of its own, that a quiet man in a loud room eventually becomes the only thing anyone is listening for. It had served him well. It was about to serve him again, in a parking lot, in front of 40 people and 2 police officers, though it would not feel like a gift while it was happening. It would feel like swallowing a stone. Now here is the part that nobody at the Harbor Crest Yacht Club knew. 2 years before that summer afternoon, an investment company called Lake Crest Holdings had quietly acquired the Harbor Crest Yacht Club and the small hospitality group that ran it. At a moment when the club was 3 months from insolvency and about to lay off 2/3 of its staff, most of whom had worked there for decades. Lake Crest had bought it, stabilized it, and kept every single employee, including the ones close to retirement, who would never have found work anywhere else at their age. The members had been told only that new ownership had come in and that their dues would not change. They had not been told who. The man who founded Lake Crest Holdings, who sat on its board, who had personally insisted on the clause that protected the older employees, did not put his name on buildings. His name was Keanu Reeves. He had come to Harbor Crest that afternoon for a specific reason, and it was not to relax. A letter had reached him through the foundation he ran. A letter from someone who would not give a name, saying that the club's management had begun treating the long-serving staff badly again, writing them up for small things, pushing the older ones toward the door, and that the protections Lake Crest had put in place were being quietly ignored by the people running the day-to-day. Keanu did not send an auditor. He never did when he could help it. He had learned that you could not understand a place from a report. You had to walk into it looking like nobody and see how it treated a nobody. So he had put on his oldest jacket and driven his beautiful old car to the club he secretly owned to find out, from the inside, whether the place was as kind as it had promised to be. He was about to find out. Just not in the way he expected. He had spent the previous hour inside the club, and what he had seen had mostly reassured him and slightly troubled him in equal measure. He had ordered a coffee at the bar and watched how the young bartender was treated by the members, and how the young bartender treated the busboy, and how the busboy treated the woman clearing plates. Because you could learn the whole moral architecture of a place by watching how courtesy flowed down the chain of who had to be nice to whom. Most of it had been fine, better than fine, in places. But he had also watched a manager speak to an older groundskeeper in a tone that had made Keanu set his coffee down. A tone that turned a grown man of 60 into something smaller, and he had filed it away, because that tone was exactly the thing the letter had warned him about, and he had come a long way to find out whether the letter was true. He had paid for his coffee in cash, left a large tip the bartender would puzzle over later, and walked out toward the lot, toward the one beautiful thing he allowed himself, intending to drive into town and think about what he had seen. He never got the chance to think about it in the way he planned, because the thinking arrived instead in the form of a woman's voice telling him to get his hands off his own car. The Harbor Crest Yacht Club sat on a bluff above the lake, all glass and pale cedar and wide decks angled toward the water, with a marina below where sailboats and sleek powerboats rocked gently at their slips except. Membership cost more per year than most people made, and the waiting list was long, And the clientele was the particular kind of wealthy that has had money long enough to believe it says something true about them. The terrace smelled of citronella and grilled fish. Below it, the marina smelled of diesel and lake water and sun-warmed wood. And that was where a man named Silas Boone was wiping down an engine cowling when the midnight blue Mustang rolled into the lot. Silas Boone was 67 years old and had maintained the boats and the docks at Harbor Crest for 30 years. He knew every slip, every hull, every member's boat by the sound of its engine. He had a bad knee and good hands and a granddaughter he was raising on his own, a sharp 12-year-old named Ruby, whose school pictures were taped to the inside of his locker. Silas had been one of the employees who would have lost everything 2 years ago when the club nearly went under. And he had been one of the ones a stranger's company had quietly saved. He did not know all the details, but he knew one thing the members did not, because he had been on the dock the one time the new owner had come down to look at the marina in person, 2 years back, before anyone knew anything. He had shaken the man's hand. He had a good memory for faces, so when the Mustang's door opened and the man in the worn leather jacket stepped out, Silas Boone went very still with a rag in his hand, because he knew exactly who had just arrived, and he understood in the same instant that the man was dressed to not be known. Silas had spent his whole life around people who wanted, for one reason or another, to not be seen, and he knew how to give a man that courtesy. So he did the kindest thing he could think of. He looked back down at the engine, and he kept his mouth shut, and he let Keanu Reeves be nobody for as long as the world would allow it. The world allowed it for about 9 minutes. Diane Ashcroft was 53, and she was the membership director of the Harbor Ost Yacht Club, which meant that she was, although she had no idea of it, an employee of the hospitality group owned by Lake Crest Holdings, which meant she worked at the very end of a long chain she had never bothered to trace, for the man in the worn jacket. Diane had run membership at Harbor Crest for 9 years. She decided whose application moved forward and whose sat in a drawer. She decided who got the warm welcome at the door and who got the cool, appraising look. She thought of herself as the keeper of the club's character, its standards, and she would have told you, with complete sincerity, that this was a form of service, that someone had to protect what made a place special, and that she was simply willing to do the unpleasant work of it. This is worth slowing down for, because Diane Ashcroft was not a cartoon villain, and the story is less useful if we pretend she was. She did not think of herself as cruel. She thought of herself as discerning. When she looked across the parking lot and saw a man in a beat-up jacket standing beside a $500,000 car, the conclusion arrived before any thought did. Police assembled. That man does not belong to that car. And everything she did next, she did in the sincere belief that she was protecting her club. That is the most dangerous kind of prejudice there is. Not the kind that knows it is prejudice. The kind that has dressed itself up as responsibility and looks in the mirror and sees a good person doing a hard job. There was history in this, though no one in the parking lot knew it yet, and Diane herself had filed it away under the heading of doing her job. This was not the first time Diane Ashcroft had decided, on sight, that someone did not belong. 18 months earlier, she had reported a quiet, retired couple to security for trespassing during a club dinner, certain they wandered in from outside. They had been members for 3 years, and they had stood in the middle of a full dining room while a guard asked to see their cards. And they had finished their meal and never come back and quietly let their membership lapse. 9 months after that, she had accused a catering vendor of stealing supplies he was, in fact, delivering under a signed contract, and the man had been walked out past his own staff and had lost the account. Neither incident had ever been investigated. Both had been filed and forgotten, because Diane's certainty had a way of in the moment, exactly like diligence, and because the people on the receiving end of it were never the kind of people the club worried about losing. The pattern was there, in the files, waiting. It would take a reporter and a viral video to dig it out. For now, it was simply the invisible groundwater under everything Diane did. the accumulated confidence of a woman who had been wrong about people many times and had never once been made to feel it. She had been crossing the lot toward the terrace when she saw him press the key fob, saw the Mustang's lights blink, saw him reach for the door handle. And instead of the obvious thought that a man with the key to a car is generally the owner of the car, Diane's certainty supplied a different story. And she opened her mouth, and the afternoon tilted. "Get your hands off that car before I call the police." Keanu turned. He took her in, the expensive blazers, the precise hair, the face arranged into an expression of righteous alarm, and he felt the old familiar weariness settle over him, the specific tiredness of a man who has been handed this exact script before and knows every line of it, and knows that none of his lines will work. "This is my car," he said again quietly. He did not move toward her. He kept his hands where she could see them, the keys held loosely, visibly in his right hand. He had learned that, too, somewhere along the way, the same way Silas had learned it, the same way a great many people learn it. Keep your hands where they can be seen, and keep your voice low, and give the frightened, certain person in front of you nothing they can turn into a weapon. "I've been the membership director here for 9 years, Diane said, and now there was an edge of performance in it, her voice pitched for the terrace. "I know our members. I have never seen you in my life. And men who belong to this club do not show up looking like they slept in their car." She pulled her phone from her blazer pocket. "You have 10 seconds to walk away from that vehicle." "I'm not going to walk away from my own car," Keanu said. So she dialed. Now, the call she made would matter a great deal later, so it is worth being precise as about what she said, because every word of it would eventually be played back in rooms she did not want it played back in. She told the dispatcher there was a man attempting to steal a vehicle from the Harbor Crest Yacht Club. She said he was acting aggressively. She said he had refused to leave and that she felt unsafe. Keanu had not moved from beside the car. He had said, in total, perhaps a dozen words, all of them quiet. But in the story Diane was telling, and by now she fully believed the story, a man who looked like that, standing beside a car like that, declining to flee when ordered, was as a crime already in progress, and the only question was how fast help would come. She hung up and crossed her arms and looked, for a moment, deeply satisfied, the look of a woman who believes she has just done her community a service. Up on the terrace, 2 teenagers, a member's kids, bored with the adults, had drifted to the railing. One of them, a girl of about 15, had already taken her phone out and was filming, because something in the body language below had told her, with the instinct her whole generation seemed to be born with, that this was going to be something. Keanu saw the phone. He did not react to it. He simply stood beside the Mustang in the warm afternoon light, the keys loose in his hand, his face perfectly calm, and he waited for the police he secretly employed to arrive and arrest him for touching his own car. Down at the marina, Silas Boone set down his rag. His jaw had gone tight. He looked toward the parking lot, at the man by the blue Mustang and the woman with the phone and the small crowd gathering at the terrace railing, and the old familiar terrible feeling started to climb in his chest. The feeling of watching something wrong began to happen, on what it would cost him to step into them quiet, on what it boxed him to step into the middle of it. 2 patrol cars rolled into the club entrance, about 8 minutes later. No sirens, but the light bars were going, blue and white, pulsing across the pale cedar face of the clubhouse, and the crunch of their tires on the gravel made every head on the terrace turn at once. People set down their glasses. The afternoon had found its theater, and Keanu Reeves, standing alone beside the Mustang, was the show. The first officer out was a man named Gary Vance, white, mid-40s, built thick through the shoulders, with a short, fading haircut and the particular walk of a man who had decided what was happening before he arrived. His hand rested near his belt, not on the weapon, but close enough to be a sentence without words. He walked straight past Diane, past the valet stand, straight to Keanu, because in the story Officer Vance had also already assembled in his head, there was only one person in this parking lot who needed walking toward. The second officer came to the second car for more slowly. Her name was Renata Cole, and she was younger, and she did the thing officers do and bad ones never learn, which was to look at the whole scene before she moved into it. She saw the man by the car, standing still, hands visible, shoulders loose, no aggression anywhere in his body. She saw the woman in the blazer already moving toward the officers with the eager step of someone who believed she was part of the investigation. She filed it away. She did not say anything yet. "Sir, step away from the vehicle," Vance said. Keanu took one step back from the car, hands at his sides, the keys still visible in his palm. "Can I ask what this is about, officer?" "We got a report of a vehicle theft. This your car?" "It is. The registration's in the glove box. My license is in my pocket." "I'm happy to show you both." "Slowly," Vance said. Keanu reached into his jacket slowly. The way you move when you understand that every motion you make is going to be read by someone looking for a reason. And he produced a worn leather wallet, and from it his driver's license and, a moment later, leaning carefully into the car, the vehicle registration. He handed them over, both matched. Keanu Reeves, the midnight blue Shelby. His name, his face, his car, in black and white. Vancent looked at the documents a long moment. He looked at the car. He looked at Keanu, at the worn jacket and the stubble. And then he looked over at Diane Ashcroft, who had arrived at his elbow and was nodding along as though her presence confirmed something. "Officer, I'm the membership director here," Diane said, and her voice had changed, had gone smooth and helpful, the voice of a concerned citizen assisting the authorities. "I've worked at this club for 9 years. I have never seen this man here before. That car does not belong to someone like him. Someone like him." The 3 words hung in the warm air. Officer Cole's eyes flicked to her partner and then away. She caught the words. She kept them. But Vance did not flinch at them. He turned back to Keanu, and he did not hand the documents back. "Going to need you to wait here while I sort this out." "My documents are clean, officer. The name on the license matches the name on the registration. There's nothing to sort. Complaint was filed. I have to follow procedure." And he walked back toward his cruiser with Keanu's license and registration still in his hand. And there it was. Keanu was now, for all practical purposes, detained. No handcuffs, no charge, no crime. But a man cannot leave a parking lot without his license. And Vance knew it, and the knowing was the point. This is the quiet machinery worth naming, because it runs on procedure and looks, from the outside, almost reasonable. A man had shown a valid license and a matching registration for a car. That is, in the plain meaning of the words, the end of a vehicle theft inquiry. There was no longer anything to investigate. But Officer Vance had decided something in the first 3 seconds, the same thing Diane had decided. And, like Diane, he was now spending all his energy defending the decision instead of checking it. And he had at his disposal something Diane did not, which was the lawful-looking power to make a man stand in a parking lot against his will. A club manager named Trent Maddox had come out the front doors by now, drawn by the lights, and he hurried over and confirmed it directly. "Officer, this is Mr. Reeves. He's a member. I can pull his record right now. There's no issue here." Vance barely glanced at him. "Lady filed a report. I follow it through." Maddox opened his mouth, closed it, glanced at Keanu with an expression caught somewhere between apology and self-preservation, and went back inside. Another person who had seen the whole thing and chosen the comfort of the building over the discomfort of the parking lot. Up on the terrace, the crowd had thickened along the railing. More phones were out now, held up over the rail, angled down at the man by the blue car. Not one of them was pointed at Diane. An older man in a navy blazer shook his head slowly, though whether at Diane or at Keanu or at the whole tedious scene you could not have said, and he did not speak, and after a moment he turned back to his wine. A young couple murmured to each other, uneasy, and stayed exactly there were and did exactly nothing. The only person who looked like he might actually move was down at the marina, gripping the edge of a workbench until his knuckles paled. Silas Boone knew the truth of this. Not a guess, not a feeling. He knew, the way you know your own name, that the man standing in that parking lot owned the ground all of them were standing on. And he knew something else, too, something the members on the terrace would never have to know in their lives. He knew exactly what it would cost a 67-year-old dockhand with a bad knee and a granddaughter to walk up that slope and contradict a police officer and a club director in front of 40 members. He had been written up 2 months ago for what his manager had called tone, after he had politely, carefully, told a member she could not take her boat off in the fire lane. 9 years on, no, 30 years on. 30 years of yes, sir, and right away and careful courtesy, and one moment of being correct had gone into his file. He knew what speaking up could cost. His job, the health insurance. Ruby's braces, the ones the orthodontist had just fitted. All of it gone, if the wrong person decided Silas Boone had been difficult. He also knew what staying silent would cost. It was a smaller cost, and a heavier one, the kind that does not show up on any bill, but sits in a man's chest for years. Silas wiped his hands on the rag, slow, and he started up the slope. He did the arithmetic as he climbed, because he was a careful man, and he had always done the arithmetic. If he walked up there and contradicted Diane Ashcroft and a police officer in front of 40 members, one of two things would happen. Either it would help, or it would not. And he had been alive long enough, and black long enough, and poor long enough, to know which way that particular bet usually landed. The write-up 2 months ago was still fresh in his file. His manager had used the word tone, that soft weaponized word, and had told him to be mindful of how he came across, as though 30 years of how he came across had not been enough, as though a single instance of being correct about a fire lane could outweigh 3 decades of yes, sir, and right away. He knew how thin the ice was under a man like him. He knew that Ruby had a dentist appointment on Thursday, and that the insurance that paid for it was attached to a job he was about to risk for a man who, as far as anyone up that slope knew, was a stranger. But Silas also knew the other side of the ledger, the side that does not show up in any accounting. He knew what it would feel like, for the rest of his life, to have stood at the bottom of that slope with the truth in his hand and his mouth shut. He had done that before, more times than he wanted to count, in 30 years of being the only one of him on shift. Each time it had cost him something he could not name and could not get back. He was 67 years old. He did not have an unlimited number of these moments left, and he had decided, somewhere around the 5th step, that he was not going to spend one of the last ones being careful. While Silas climbed, Officer Vance came back from his cruiser, Keanu's documents still in his hand, undelivered. He stopped 3 feet front of Keanu. Close, a deliberate closeness. Going to need you to open up the vehicle. Pop the trunk. Let me take a look inside. No, Keanu said. The word landed flat and quiet in the space between them. Vance's jaw moved. He was not a man who heard that word often, and never from someone in the position he had decided Keanu was in. You got nothing to hide. Why not just open it up? Because you don't have a warrant, Keanu said, and you don't have probable cause. I've shown you a license and a registration that match. I'm declining the search. That's my right under the 4th Amendment, and I'm going to exercise it. He said it without heat, without challenge. Just a plain statement of the law by a man who knew it cold, and that, more than anything, seemed to bother Vance, who was used to the law being a thing he administered, rather than a thing that could be quoted back at him by a man in a worn jacket. I'm trying to help you here, Vance said. No, officer. You're trying to search my car without authority, and I'm telling you, politely, no. Vance stared at him for a long 5 seconds. Then he turned away, keyed his shoulder radio, and Keanu heard the words go out over the static, calm, and devastating. Requesting a K-9 unit, possible vehicle theft, subject, uncooperative. Subject, uncooperative. Keanu had handed over every document, answered every question, never once raised his voice. But he had said no to an unlawful search, and in the grammar of that parking lot, knowing your rights had just been converted evidence against you. The dog was 20 minutes out, which meant the man who owned the club, the lot, and the car was going to stand in that lot for at least another 20 minutes, under the lights, in front of 40 people filming him, for a crime that had never happened. While we wait, Vance said, turning back, I'm going to need you to have a seat. on the curb. He pointed at the concrete edge of the parking island. The curb. As though Keanu were a teenager caught lifting candy from a gas station, as though the lip of concrete at the edge of a parking lot were the natural place for a man like the one Vance had decided he was. Keanu looked at the curb. He looked back at Vance. "I'll stand. I said have a seat." And I said I'll stand. I haven't been charged with anything. I'm not under arrest. You've confirmed my license and my registration. I'll wait, because you've asked me to, but I'll wait on my feet. Vance stepped in closer, close enough that Keanu could smell the coffee on his breath, close enough that the body camera on the officer's chest could see Keanu's torso, but not his face. A framing that might have been an accident and might not have been, but was, either way, convenient. "You really want to make this harder than it has to be?" "I'm not making anything hard, officer," Keanu said, as his voice did not rise even as a half step. "I'm standing in a parking lot next to my own car. That's all that's happening here. Everything else is something you're adding." The moment stretched. 5 seconds. 10. On the terrace, you could have heard a glass set down. The flag on the clubhouse pole snapped once in the breeze and went still. It was Officer Cole who broke it. She stepped in, easy and professional, her body angling between the two men without seeming to. "Let's just wait for the unit, Gary. He's not going anywhere." She said it lightly, but she put herself there on purpose, and Keanu saw it, and Vance saw it too, and he stepped back half a step, his eyes staying on Keanu the way a dog watches a fence. Renata Cole had been on the job 6 years, long enough to have learned the things they do not teach at the academy. She had learned that the most dangerous moment in any stop is the one where an officer's pride gets tangled up with an officer's authority. Because pride cannot be de-escalated, only authority can. And a man defending his pride with a badge is the hardest thing in the world to talk down. She was watching that happen now, in real time, to her partner. She had seen the documents. She had heard the manager. She had watched a 30-year employee climb a hill to vouch for the man and get waved off. Every instinct she had, every piece of training she trusted, told her this stop should have ended 15 minutes ago. And she had said so, twice, and been overruled by a man with 4 years more seniority and a story he had already decided to believe. So she did the only thing rank allowed her to do. She stood close, and she stayed ready, and she kept her own body between the worst version of her partner and the man by the car, and she waited, and she hated how little that was. The crowd on the terrace had its own weather. People drifted to the railing and drifted back. Some filmed, some only watched. An older man in a navy blazer shook his head and said something to his wife and did not move. A young couple stood close together, the woman's face uneasy, and the man put a hand on her back, as if to say there's nothing we can do. Which was not true. There was a great deal they could have done. They could have walked down the steps and stood beside the man at the car and made him one of them instead of one of him. But they did not, because the steps felt very long, and the wine was very cold. And somebody official was already handling it. That is how it almost always goes. Not with cruelty, from most of them, with the small, comfortable cowardice of people who would describe themselves sincerely as kind, and who watch an injustice from a railing with a drink in their hand and tell themselves it is being handled. Keanu felt all of it. He had a particular sensitivity to crowds, earned over a lifetime of being looked at. And he could feel the difference between the people who were enjoying this and the people who were ashamed of it, and the people, the largest group, who simply wished it would resolve so they could stop having to feel anything about it. He filed it away. He was good at that. He had learned, somewhere along the way, that memory is a kind of evidence, and he stood in the center of all those watching faces and quietly cataloged the afternoon. Every face, every word, the exact thing Diane had said, and the exact way Vance had said subject into his ratio, not out of vengeance, but out of the deep, patient certainty of a man who knew that the truth would eventually need witnesses, and intended to be one. That was when Silas Boone reached the top of the slope. He did not go to Vance. He had lived long enough to know better than to bring a contradiction to the angry man. He went to the woman, to Officer Cole, and he held out the tablet he used for the marina logs, and his voice was steady even though his hands were not. Officer, ma'am, that's Mr. Reeves. I've worked these docks 30 years. That's his car. I've seen him drive it, and he's a member here, more than a member. He had almost said it then, the whole truth, and he caught it at the last second. Because it was not his truth to tell, it belonged to the man in the jacket. And so he said only, he belongs here more than just about anybody. You've got this wrong. Cole looked at the tablet. She looked at Silas at the 30 years in his face. She took the tablet to Vance and showed him. Vance glanced at it for less than 2 seconds. Could be a car he's been driving for somebody. Doesn't prove ownership. We wait for the unit. And that was that. 30 years of knowing every boat on the lake, dismissed in 2 seconds. Silas stood there a moment with the tablet in his shaking hands. And he looked across the lot at Keanu, and Keanu looked back at him. And Keanu did a small thing then, a thing that cost nothing and meant everything. He gave Silas Boone one slow nod. It was not a thank you for fixing the problem, because Silas had not been able to fix it. It was something better. It said, I saw what you just did. I know exactly what it cost you to do it. I will not forget it. Silas walked back down to the marina. He sat on an overturned bucket by the workbench, and for a while he did not trust his hands to hold anything. Up in the lot, Diane Ashcroft had not finished. She drifted over to the officers, uninvited, and added to the fire she had already set. Officer, I want you to know, before he went to the car, I saw him moving between the other vehicles. Looking into them, I think he was casing the lot. It was a lie, whole and clean. Keanu had walked in a straight line from the clubhouse to his car. And when I first confronted him, he became aggressive. He told me I'd regret it if I didn't walk away. He had said no such thing. He had said, this is my car, and I'm not going to walk away from my own car. But Diane said it with the unshakable confidence of a woman who had never in her life been seriously doubted. And Vance wrote it down. And he did not ask for a witness. And he did not check the marina security camera mounted on a post not 40 feet away. Its lens pointed directly at the row where the Mustang sat. Keanu watched him write it down. His pulse climbed, not from fear, but from the slow burn of watching systems do precisely what it was built to do. Watching a lie become a line in a report because the person telling it looked the part and the person it was told about did not. His jaw tightened. His free hand closed once, briefly, and then opened. He breathed 4 counts in, 4 counts out, and he kept the keys visible in his other hand, and he did not raise his voice, because he understood the way Silas understood. The way every person who's ever stood in a version of this parking lot understands, that his anger, however earned, would be the first thing they entered into evidence. So he stood still, and he reached into his jacket, and he took out his phone, and he made one call. The phone rang twice before it was answered. Marcus. It's me. Keanu's voice was low, almost a murmur, the kind of voice you use when you do not want the people around you to hear, but you need every word to land. I'm at Harbor Crest. I need you to come down here, and I need you to bring the Lake Crest file. The acquisition documents, the org chart, all of it. A pause on the other end. Then the voice of Marcus Doyle, who had been Keanu's friend for 30 years, who had sat beside him in rooms where deals worth more than this club were decided in an afternoon, and who could read the temperature of his friend's voice in a single sentence. How bad? Bad enough. There's a unit here. They've got my license, and they've called for a dog. I'm 40 minutes out. Make it less. Keanu put the phone back in his pocket. Across the lot, Diane Ashcroft was leaning against the valet stand with her 2 friends, relaxed now, even laughing. The posture of a woman who believed the hard part was over, and the outcome had gone her way. Keanu watched her for a moment, and what was in his face was not anger and not even triumph. It was something closer to sorrow, the particular sorrow of a man who can see exactly how much the next hour is going to cost a person who still thinks she is winning. Marcus Doyle made it in 26 minutes. The 26 minutes were their own small eternity. The K9 unit had not yet arrived. It was stuck behind an accident on the highway down the mountain, and so the parking lot simply held, 40 people, and 2 officers, and 1 woman, and 1 man. All of them waiting for something none of them could quite name. Keanu stood by the Mustang the entire time, keys still visible in his open hand, and he did not check his watch, and he did not pace, and he did not speak. Diane Ashcroft's certainty had begun, somewhere in those minutes, to develop hairline cracks. She had expected the man to be gone by now. Hauled off, the disruption resolved, the club restored to its proper order. Instead, he simply stood there, calm, unbothered, with the patience of a man who knew something the rest of them did not. And his calm was starting to frighten her in a way she could not have explained. Guilty men did not wait like that. Guilty men got loud or got scared or ran. This man waited like someone said who had already seen the end of the afternoon and was simply being polite enough to let everyone else catch up. A black sedan rolled through the club gates, unhurried, and a man got out who did not match the afternoon at all. Charcoal suit, perfectly cut, a leather portfolio under one arm. He buttoned his jacket, he adjusted one cuff, and then he walked across the gravel toward the cruisers at a pace that suggested he had never once in his life arrived anywhere late or flustered, because he had not. Marcus Doyle had known Keanu for 30 years, since the two of them were young and broke, and certain the world owed them nothing, which had turned out to be both true and the most useful thing either of them ever learned. He had built a career out of walking into rooms exactly like this one and rearranging them, quietly, with paper. He did not believe in shouting. He believed in documents, in the slow, devastating power of a fact laid flat on a table where everyone could see it. And he had read, in the 4 words of Keanu's phone call, "Bring the Lakecrest file," exactly what kind of afternoon his friend was having, and exactly what would end it. Diane noticed him first. Something in her smile faltered. She did not know who he was, but she knew the suit, knew the walk, knew the portfolio, the way an animal knows weather, and a small uncertainty moved into her face for the first time that afternoon. Marcus walked past her, without a glance. He went straight to Vance. "Officer, my name is Marcus Doyle. I'm an attorney, and I represent the gentleman you've been detaining." He did not wait for a response. He set the portfolio on the hood of the cruiser and opened it, and began to lay documents on the warm metal, one at a time, calm and unhurried, like a man dealing cards in a game he had already won. The title to the vehicle: a 1967 Shelby Mustang, midnight blue, registered owner Keanu Reeves. Clear title, no liens, 1 sheet. The incorporation filings for Lakecrest Holdings, founder and majority shareholder Keanu Reeves. A second, the acquisition agreement, dated 2 years ago, by which Lakecrest Holdings purchased the Harbor Crest Yacht Club and its parent hospitality group out of insolvency. A third, and the organizational chart of that hospitality group. A fourth, and on this one he put his finger, and he moved it down a column to a name and held it there. Diane Ashcroft, membership director, an employee of the company that is wholly owned by Lakecrest Holdings. He let his hand rest on the page. Then he straightened, and he turned, and he raised his voice for the first time, pitching it so that it carried across the lot, and up to the terrace railing, and into every phone aimed down at the scene. "Let me make this very clear, officer. My client is not stealing anything from this club. My client owns this club, and the woman who called the police on him." He turned and looked directly at Diane Ashcroft. "She works for him." The silence that followed was not the awkward kind. It was the kind that arrives when the ground shifts under everyone at the same instant. When 40 people understand precisely that they have just watched something they will not be able to unwatch. Diane Ashcroft's face did not drain slowly. It went all at once, the color simply gone, as though someone had pulled a plug somewhere behind her eyes. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out of it. For a moment, she simply stood there while the arithmetic ran behind her eyes, the same arithmetic she had refused to do an hour ago, when it might have saved her. The man in the worn jacket owned the company. The company employed her. She had called the police on him. She had called him a thief in front of 40 members, into a recording she now dimly understood, had been running the entire time on a teenager's phone. And then, Because some people cannot stop defending the verdict even as the verdict collapses on top of them, she tried. I didn't know, she said. Her voice had lost all its earlier authority. It came out thin. How could I have known? He wasn't dressed, anyone would have thought. I was protecting the club. That's my job. I was doing my job. She took a step toward Keanu, her hands coming up, palms open, the gesture of a person reaching for a railing that is no longer there. Mr. Reeves, if I had known who you were, this is all just a terrible misunderstanding. If you'll let me explain, I was only ever thinking of everyone's safety. And there it was, the whole of it, in the space of 3 sentences. Not I am sorry I did this to you. Not I was wrong about a man because of how he looked. But how could I have known? As though the wrong were in her, not knowing rather than in the certainty she had built on top of not knowing. She was, even now, even as the ground gave way, the heroine of her own version, a diligent woman undone by a misunderstanding. And Keanu watched her perform it and understood that she believed every word, and that this, more than anything she had said in the parking lot, was the thing that could not be repaired. Keanu held up one hand, palm flat. The universal sign for stop. He did not raise his voice. He had not raised it once all afternoon, and he did not raise it now. You didn't know who I was, he said. That's true. But that isn't the part that matters, Mrs. Ashcroft. You didn't call the police because of who I am. You called them because of who you decided I was, before I'd said a word to you. And if I'd been who you thought I was, a man with an old jacket and no lawyer and no name on anything, everything you did today would have worked. That's the part worth thinking about. Not that you got it wrong about me. That you'd have gotten it right about getting away with it on somebody else. He let his hand fall. We'll be in touch, he said, 3 quiet words. And everyone in the lot understood that being in touch with the man who owned the company you worked for, after what she had just done, was not a thing Diane Ashcroft was going to enjoy. And here is where the story refuses you the clean and total victory. Because real reckonings are messier than the ones we wish for, and this one was no exception. Officer Vance looked at the documents on the hood of his car. He looked at Keanu. He looked at the ground. And then he did the thing men like Vance almost always do, which was not to apologize, but to reach for the railing of procedure and hold on. Documentation appears to be in order, he said, his voice flat, official, already building the version of this he could live inside. I was responding to a citizen complaint. I followed protocol based on the information available to me at the scene. He gathered Keanu's license and registration, which he had held for the better part of an hour, and held them out, and when Keanu took them, Vance did not meet his eyes. You're free to go. You called for a dog, Keanu said quietly, on a man who'd shown you a matching license and registration. You ignored the manager. You ignored a 30-year employee. And you wrote down a story you didn't check. He was not shouting. He never would. I'd think about that if I were you. Not because of who I am. Because of who the next man's going to be. The one who shows you a clean license and doesn't have a lawyer to call. Vance said nothing. He got into his cruiser and closed the door and stared at his own steering wheel, as though the answer to the afternoon might be written on it. Marcus produced one more thing then, almost as an afterthought. Though Marcus Doyle never did anything as his afterthought. He looked at Officer Cole, the younger one, who had stood through all of it with a tightening jaw. There's a security camera on that post, he said, nodding toward the marina, with a clean line on this row. Mrs. Ashcroft told your partner my client was, and I'm quoting the report he just wrote, moving between vehicles and casing the lot, and that he threatened her. The camera will show my client walked in a straight line from the clubhouse to his car and never came within 15 feet of her. You'll want that footage before it cycles. I'd hate for a false port charge to fall apart over a deleted tape. Officer Cole looked at him for a moment, and then she nodded once, and she walked toward the marina post, and that small walk was the first wholly honest thing the law had done all afternoon. Now let me tell you where everyone landed, because nothing here landed evenly, and pretending it did would be its own kind of lie. Diane Ashcroft was terminated within the week. That part was swift and certain. The video the teenager had filmed was online before Keanu had even left the lot, and a seconds have followed. The one that caught Marcos turning to the crowd and saying she works for him. And the internet did what it does. For a few weeks, Diane Ashcroft was the most disliked woman in Northern California. But she did not go to prison. She was charged with filing a false police report, a misdemeanor, and the case ended in probation and a fine and a diversion program, and a civil settlement that cost her a sum that hurt but did not ruin her. And she never, as far as anyone could tell, actually understood what she had done. In the one interview she gave, months later, she described herself as the real victim, a woman whose understandable concern for her community had been twisted by a mob, and she said it with the same sincerity she had brought to the parking lot. Because some people never do get the lesson. They only get the version of the story that lets them sleep, and they move into it and they live there. And the rest of us have to make our peace with the fact that the reckoning we wanted is not always the reckoning that comes. Officer Gary Vance was placed on administrative leave while the department conducted an internal review. The body camera footage was not kind to him. It showed a man ignoring valid documents, refusing to return a license, ordering a citizen to sit on a curb, calling for a dog with no cause. The review concluded, eventually, that he had violated department procedure. He was suspended. He was required to retrain. He was not fired, and he was not charged with anything. And within the year, he was back on patrol in a different precinct because the systems that are supposed to hold a Gary Vance to account are built, in the end, mostly to protect him. And that is the truth even when it is not the ending we want. Officer Renata Cole gave a written statement that contradicted her partner's account in every particular, and noted that she had twice recommended Keanu be released. It cost her. There is a particular coldness that settles around an officer who breaks ranks, and it settled around her, and she carried it, and she did not regret what she had done. But she did not pretend it was free. And Silas Boone. Silas, who had climbed that slope on a bad knee to tell the truth to people who did not want it, who had been dismissed in 2 seconds, did not lose his job. Quite the opposite. But the story will not tie his ribbon too neatly, because the thing that protected Silas Boone in the end was not justice. It was luck. It was the fact that the man he had stood up for happened to own the company. Keanu thought about that a great deal afterward, the comfortable arithmetic of it, that a good man's courage had been rewarded only because, by pure chance, the person he defended had the power to reward it. There are 10,000 Silas Boones who step forward in parking lots every year and lose everything for it. And the only difference in this case was an accident of who was standing beside the car. Keanu knew it. It kept him up some nights. What he could do, he did. The complaint that had brought him to Harbor Crest turned out to be true. The management had been quietly pushing the older staff toward the door, and Keanu replaced that management. And he wrote the protections for the long-serving employees into the bylaws where no manager could quietly ignore them again. Silas Boone was made harbor master, with an office and a raise, and more to the point, with the standing to never again have to climb a slope on a bad knee to be dismissed into specific. A reporter named Nina Reyes dug into Diane Ashcroft's 9 years at the club and found 2 other people she had quietly driven out, a family and a vendor, neither of whom got a viral video or a settlement or anything at all, except the memory of being made to feel like thieves in a place they had every right to be. Some of them Keanu was able to find and reach out to and make something right with. Some of them he never found. That is also part of the truth. Nina Reyes had started with the video, like everyone else, but she was the kind of reporter who did not stop at the thing everyone was already looking at. She pulled what records she could. She found the retired couple who had been asked for their membership cards in the middle of a full dining room and had finished their meal in silence and never returned. She found the caterer who had been walked out past his own staff over supplies he had a signed contract to deliver, who had lost not just that account, but 2 others when word got around, the way word does. Neither of them had filmed anything. Neither had a lawyer. They had simply absorbed it the way most people absorb it, and folded it into the long, quiet ledger of indignities that people who look a certain way or come from a certain place carry without ever being asked to. When Nina laid all three incidents side by side, the park's lot stopped looking like a single bad afternoon and started looking like what it actually was, which was the one time the pattern happened to pick a man who could afford to make it visible. Her story ran, and it was good, and it was careful, and it changed a few minds, and Keanu read it and thought, as he often did now, about how thin the line had been, how the only reason any of it became a story at all was the accident of whose hand had been on the car door. The closing scene is a small one, a few months on. It is early on a Saturday, before the members arrive, and the lake is doing the thing Keanu drives a long way to watch, turning from slate to silver to hard bright blue as the sun clears the eastern ridge. The midnight blue Mustang is parked in the lot, in no special spot, and a man in a worn jacket is sitting on a bench above the marina with a paper cup of coffee, watching the light come up off the water. Silas Boone comes out onto the dock below. Harbor master now, with a clipboard he mostly carries out of 30 years of habit, and he sees the man on the bench and lifts one hand in an easy wave. And Keanu lifts one back, and neither of them says anything, because they are two men who have learned that the best things mostly do not need to be said. So a young woman comes out of the clubhouse, new, hired in the last month, carrying a tray to set up the terrace for brunch. She does not know who the man on the bench is. She has never seen his face in a magazine, or if she has, she does not connect it to a tired man in a beat-up jacket drinking gas station coffee at 7 in the morning. She just sees a person sitting alone, and she calls out, friendly, unforced morning. Coffee's fresh inside if you want a real cup. Keanu lifts his paper cup in thanks and smiles. I'm all right, but thank you. She nods and goes about setting the tables, and that is the whole of it, a small, unremarkable kindness that's offered to a stranger who looked like nobody in particular, asking nothing in return, expecting nothing back. She will never know that it mattered. She will never know that a man drove up from the city and put on his oldest jacket, and stood through an afternoon he would rather forget, all to find out whether a place could do exactly the small thing she just did without thinking about it. And that, more than the lawyer, more than the documents, more than the look on Diane Ashcroft's face when the ground gave way beneath her, is the thing he drove up to find out. Whether the place was kind to a stranger who looked like nobody. This one, today, with this young woman who did not know and did not care who he was kind. It was a small thing. It was the only thing he had ever actually wanted from any of it. He finished his coffee. He watched the light finish coming up off the lake, slate to silver to that hard, bright blue, the way he had watched it every morning of his life that he could manage to. Then he got into the old car his father had let him sit in the ghost of half a century ago, and he drove home, slowly, like a man with nowhere he needed to be. I keep coming back to the keys. Not the lawyer, not the documents on the hood of the cruiser, not the moment the whole terrace understood at once. The keys. Keanu held them in his open hand the entire time, visible, never closing his fist around them, because he knew that a closed fist would be read as a threat, and an open hand would not. And he had learned that distinction the way you learn things that have cost other people their lives. He stood in a parking lot he owned and held the keys to a car that was his in an open palm, so that the men with the power to hurt him would have nothing to point to. That is the detail I cannot put down. We want to believe this is a story about a rich man who proved he was rich. And in a way it is, and that is the least interesting thing about it. The thing that stays with me is Silas Boone, who knew the truth before anyone, who had no documents and no lawyer and no beautiful car with his name on the title, who had only 30 years and an open face and the willingness to climb a slope and be dismissed in 2 seconds. Keanu had a way to prove he was telling the truth. Silas only had the truth. And the distance between those two things, between having the truth and being able to prove it, is the whole distance this story is actually about. Most people live on the Silas side of that distance their entire lives. That is the part that stays with me. While this story is fictional, The lessons about who gets believed and who has to prove it are very real. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you, and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.